This is certainly a new experience for me. Perhaps many of you are already used to it, but I'm looking forward to getting my feet wet in distance learning. We'll see how it goes. At any rate, let me begin by thanking the sponsors or my hosts for this opportunity to speak to you. And also let me thank each one of you for participating. Hopefully you're going to find this workshop of interest. Before beginning the formal part of my presentation, I'd like to make a few preliminary remarks. First, as suggested by the title of my new book, Zen Terror in Pre-War Japan, I did not intend to write a history of that era, but rather to show how it was possible for Japanese Zen Buddhists to become involved in domestic terrorism and the role Zen training played in their actions. However, in the course of writing the book, I realized I was gaining new insights into what had actually taken place. It is some of these insights I would like to share this evening. For that purpose, I have prepared 34 slides that will lay out my hypothesis. Most of them I will ask you to read on your own as I comment on their content. However, for a few important slides, I will read their contents out loud. I understand we have 2 hours for this workshop, and I hope to finish the slides within the first 75 minutes, leaving at least 45 minutes for your comments and discussion. So let's begin. With that said, let me begin by suggesting that while the method the Nazis used to gain power in Germany in the 1930s is well known, the same cannot be said for the advent of totalitarianism in Japan during the same period. Specifically, what was the process by which Taisho democracy was brought to an end in Japan? I want to raise the question of whether a conspiracy might have existed to destroy Taisho democracy using a series of false flag incidents designed for that purpose. Since I'm going to be talking a lot about the very controversial term conspiracy, let's start with the definition of what a conspiracy is. Fortunately, at least the definition of a conspiracy is simple and straightforward. The key elements of a conspiracy are the existence of a plan to do something harmful that is both secret and carried out by a group, not an individual. However, if the definition is clear, historical manifestations or expressions of conspiracies are anything but clear. A key related definition is that of a false flag incident. For a false flag incident is one type of conspiracy. Like all conspiracies, false flag incidents are carried out secretly by a group. A false flag incident is also a form of terrorism in that the incident seeks to influence a larger group of people in a way that is advantageous to the perpetrators. However, a unique element of a false flag incident is that a purposeful effort is made to shift blame for the incident to those who were not responsible. Let us then take a look at a historical false flag incident in Nazi Germany, the Reichstag fire of 1933. Although Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany on 30 January 1933, the Nazi Party held less than a majority of seats in parliament. Therefore, it could not pass laws without the support of other political parties. Needless to say, Hitler and the Nazis sought to establish a dictatorship in which they and they alone would become the sole political party in Germany. But how to do that? The answer, as if heaven sent, was the Reichstag fire of 27 February 1933, less than a month after Hitler had become Chancellor. The Nazis claimed that one young Dutch communist was responsible for setting the whole building on fire. However, given the size of the blaze, that seemed like an unlikely scenario from the beginning. Let me suggest that in establishing the responsibility for an incident of this kind, one of the first questions to ask is cui bono, Latin for who benefits. In other words, who stood to benefit most from the fire? In this instance, the answer is abundantly clear: the Nazis. The Reichstag fire led to the passage of the Enabling Act, which allowed the Nazis to suppress opposition parties and rule by decree, thereby bringing an end to the Weimar Republic and its multi-party democratic government. My presentation tonight builds on the Reichstag fire and asks the question whether something similar might have happened in Japan. That is to say, was there a similar incident or incidents occurring at nearly the same time in Japan that brought an end to Taisho democracy, thereby facilitating the rise of a totalitarian society at home and military aggression abroad? In other words, did Japan have its own version of a false flag incident? Before attempting to answer this question, let us examine some undoubted historical facts. In Japan's case, the Great Depression of 1929 brought severe hardship to both farmers and factory workers. Raw silk was then Japan's single greatest export, and the depressed demand for silk meant financial hardship for both farmers and factory workers. The situation was further aggravated by a series of poor harvests in northern Japan at the beginning of the 1930s. Added to this was a growing population and a political establishment catering to the needs of the zaibatsu, or large financial combines. With 310,000 out of work, 984 strikes, and 3,419 tenant-landlord disputes in 1930, the social basis for political instability was firmly in place. The labor unrest also led to an increased crackdown on the left. Note that terrorism as a sustained movement nearly always takes place within a background of social instability. This is probably the classic photo of starvation in the Tohoku region. Classic or not, the starvation, poverty, and the selling of daughters into a life of prostitution was all too real in 1930s rural Japan. This is another classic photo, this one of young girls sold into prostitution arriving in Tokyo. In Japanese history books, the Blood Oath Corps incident, Ketsumeidan Jiken, is typically presented separately from the May 15th incident, the Goichigo Jiken. However, the two groups of assassins were originally members of one group composed of both civilians and low-ranking military officers and cadets. The May 15th incident resulted in the death of Inukai Tsuyoshi, Prime Minister and head of the Seiyukai political party. Inukai's death, coupled with the two earlier assassinations, contributed substantially to enhancing political and social instability. The original planning for the assassinations called for band members to act together, but the outbreak of the Shanghai incident in January 1932 meant that the military members were unavailable before May of 1932. Inoue Junnosuke, civilian head of the combined terrorist band, decided that the civilians would act first with the expectation that the military members would launch a second round of attacks after they returned from Shanghai. While saving the details of Inoue's life for later, it is important to note here that taken as a whole, these two incidents also brought an end to government cabinets based on political parties. Instead, prime ministers from then on were appointed by the emperor in consultation with his senior advisors, including military leaders. This essentially removed any democratic check on the imperial military and enabled the military to exercise ever greater influence on the government of the day. It is this death of Taisho democracy that scholars like Maruyama Masao have described as the birth of fascism from below, eventually leading to the Asia-Pacific War. Let us now look at one of the Zen-trained terrorists, a young man by the name of Onumachol. Onuma was a one-time baker's assistant and carpenter's apprentice. Here we see him at the time of his trial, a rather happy-looking young man. Let me now read Onuma's testimony. After starting my practice of Zazen, I entered a state of samadhi the likes of which I had never experienced before. I felt my spirit become unified, really unified, and then I opened my eyes from their half-closed meditative position. I noticed the smoke from the incense curling up and touching the ceiling. At this point, it suddenly occurred to me. It suddenly came to me. I would be able to carry out the assassination of Inoue Junnosuke that night. That is 9 February 1932. Inoue Junnosuke was the Secretary General of Rikken Minseito, the Constitutional Democratic Party, and the former Minister of Finance. Junnosuke had been shot as he entered Komamoto Elementary School in Tokyo to deliver an election speech. Onuma decided to shoot Junnosuke as he entered the school instead of as he left in order to lessen the danger that members of the public might be injured during the assassination. Among other things, Junnosuke advocated cooperation with the U.S. and protection of Japanese interests through diplomacy. Like his party, Junnosuke was also opposed to a full-scale military invasion of China. The terrorist band's trial began on 28 June 1933. However, this first trial was cut short, and a second trial began on 27 March 1934. This is a photo of the second trial and indicates something very unusual was going on. Namely, if you look closely, you will see that the accused are not wearing prison uniforms, but instead haori and hakama. They were allowed to dress formally like this because they had petitioned for the removal of the chief judge at their first trial. That is to say, when the first chief judge refused to allow the defendants to testify about the patriotic motives for their assassinations, the defendants accused the chief judge of yawning and looking around the courtroom as proof of his inattention. Amazingly, their accusations resulted in the replacement of the chief judge. The new judge allowed the defendants to describe their patriotic motivations at length. The successful removal of a chief judge appears to be a first in modern Japanese judicial history and suggests, although it does not prove, the defendants had very powerful supporters at high levels of the Japanese government. Before further discussion of the trial, let's backtrack a moment to examine the life of the head of the terrorist band, Inoue Nisho. Inoue had a troubled childhood and youth, leading him to drop out of university, though not before acquiring some Chinese language skills. This led him to Manchuria in 1909, where he first went to work for the Japanese-owned Southern Manchurian Railway, and concurrently secret work as a spy for the Imperial Army. His spying focused on logistical support for Chinese revolutionary groups attempting to overthrow the Qing dynasty. During World War I, Inoue undertook a very important spying operation in the city of Qingdao, then located in a German colony. Of course, in World War I, Germany was Japan's enemy. Later, Inoue undertook what turned out to be a failed effort to make poison gas, though he escaped blame for the failure. All in all, Inoue's contributions to Japan's expansion into China demonstrated to his Imperial Army superiors that he could be trusted to successfully undertake secret missions. Inoue returned to Japan in 1920 and continued the Zen training he had begun in China in an abandoned nun's hermitage in his home village of Kawabamura. Inoue claimed to have realized enlightenment on his own in 1922 and thereafter went to continue his post-enlightenment training under one of Japan's most distinguished Rinzai Zen masters, Yamamoto Genpo. It was while training under Yamamoto that Count Tanaka Mitsuaki invited Inoue to become the lay abbot of a newly constructed non-sectarian Buddhist temple located immediately adjacent to the Emperor Meiji Memorial Pavilion, located in the seaside village of Oarai near the city of Mito, north of Tokyo. Tanaka was then 83 years old and the former imperial household minister to Emperor Meiji. Yet despite his age, Tanaka continued to assist Emperor Hirohito with personal matters. Significantly, this was Inoue's first direct contact with the imperial household, and indirectly at least to Emperor Hirohito. This is a photo of the temple Inoue headed as a lay abbot. The temple's name is Rissho Gokokudo, clearly indicating its connection to Japanese nationalism. For in English, its name means the temple to protect the state by establishing the true Dharma. Inoue was given the task of creating a band of youth who would willingly sacrifice themselves in the process of establishing a so-called Showa restoration, the nature of which I will talk about later. What then did Inoue teach the young men in the village who gathered around him? Here is one example that concerns a famous Zen story about a Chinese Zen master who is recorded as having killed the monastery's cat. Inoue taught that in case number 14 of the Mumonkan, Nansen had killed the cat out of compassion and continued, quote, "Revolution employs compassion on behalf of the society of the nation. Therefore, those who wish to participate in revolution must have a mind of great compassion towards the society of the nation. In light of this, there must be no thought of reward for participating in revolution. A revolution that does not encompass a mind of great compassion is not Buddhist. That is to say, revolution itself is the mind of great compassion." With this background in mind, let us now return to the trial. The first question to be asked is how Inoue, who made no effort to hide his leadership of the terrorist band, explained why he had encouraged his band members to carry out assassinations. At his trial, Inoue testified. In explaining why assassination was the most appropriate method to have employed, I would point out that this method required, whether successful or not, the least number of victims. The critical issue is that there was no better method for implementing what I felt sure was best for the country, untainted by the least self-interest. Yet, how did Inoue link his Zen practice to his actions? Expressing his indebtedness to both the Pure Land and Nichiren sects for contributing to his salvation, Inoue stated, "I reached where I am today thanks to Zen. Zen dislikes talking theory, so I can't put it into words, but it is true nonetheless. I have no systematized ideas. I transcend reason and act completely upon intuition." How did one of the actual assassins, Onumachol, justify the assassination of Inoue Junnosuke? At his trial, Onuma testified, quote, "Our goal was not to harm others, but to destroy ourselves. We had no thought of simply killing others while surviving ourselves. We intended to smash ourselves, thereby allowing others to cross over to a new society on top of our own bodies. I think this is what our master Inoue meant when he told us that our goal was not to sacrifice personal affections on the altar of justice, but to destroy ourselves. In the process of destroying ourselves, it couldn't be helped if there were other victims. This was the fundamental principle of our revolution. A mind of great compassion was the fundamental spirit of our revolution." It is fascinating to recognize that the above slide is part of the Chief Judge's trial verdict. The thinking is firmly grounded in the Madhyamaka school of Mahayana Buddhist philosophy that emphasizes the unity or identity of opposites. As the slide notes, Inoue and his band were found guilty and sentenced on 22 November 1934. In rendering his verdict, the presiding judge described the motivation of Inoue and his band as follows. The defendants maintain that to overthrow the old system of organization is a destructive or negative act. To establish the new system of organization is a constructive or positive act. Without destruction, however, there can be no construction. Since ultimate denial is the same as genuine affirmation, destruction is itself construction, and the two are one and inseparable. In short, a Buddhist judge rendered a Buddhist verdict on the alleged Buddhist actions of Buddhist terrorists. Prior to visiting his son in prison, Inoue's father paid a courtesy call on Toyama Mitsuru. Toyama told Inoue's father to inform his son that he would be released after 3 years. This was an amazing piece of news, for how could a terrorist sentenced to life imprisonment be released after serving only 3 years? Moreover, how could Toyama have known this? The only way Inoue could be released was through an amnesty decree issued by the emperor. However, in fact, Inoue was not released in 3 years due to the turmoil associated with the young officers' uprising of 26 February 1936. Nevertheless, when Inoue was finally released from prison in October 1940, his entire conviction was wiped from the books, leaving him without a criminal record of any kind. Clearly, Inoue had some very powerful government supporters. These are 2 more clues suggesting the possibility of a conspiracy. Who was Toyama Mitsuru? Toyama was Japan's ultimate ultranationalist fixer, who, like Tanaka Mitsuaki, took care of personal matters for Emperor Hirohito. Toyama was one of the founders of the Genyosha, dating from 1881, that agitated for Japanese military expansion and conquest of the Asian continent. Genyosha, with substantial behind-the-scenes financing, worked tirelessly for Japan's expansion into Korea and China, engaging in acts of terrorism when necessary. In 1942, the Nazi journalist Ernst Müller described Toyama as follows: "There is no man of decisive importance in Japan who does not visit Toyama to seek his advice prior to making major decisions. Toyama is the living conscience of Japan. For the past 40 to 50 years, Toyama has fought to establish Japan's dominant position in East Asia. This has made him the protecting spirit of Japanese politics and endowed him with a mysterious force that he exercises without office or power over his people, and which endows his personality with a mythical splendor while still alive." A key question to be asked here is where or from whom Toyama received his mysterious force. And where did Toyama, who was not a wealthy man himself, get the necessary funds to support his ultranationalist, sometimes terrorist activities from 1881 onwards? At any rate, with a background like this, it is hardly surprising that he would have supported Inoue and his band's terrorist acts, even providing Inoue with a place to hide prior to his arrest. This has to be one of the most unusual events in the history of terrorism. Inoue, a terrorist leader given a life sentence, is not only released from prison after serving only 6 years, but has his entire criminal record erased. And from there, he becomes the trusted live-in advisor to Japan's Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaru. Further, by this time, Prime Minister Konoe's role as Prime Minister has primarily become one of carrying out the emperor's wishes. In the next slide, Inoue describes how this came about. Inoue explained the emperor's role as follows. Once Konoe became prime minister in June 1937, things changed. No matter what the issue, Konoe first sought the emperor's consent. It was only after the emperor gave his approval that a policy was implemented. Government administered directly by the emperor came about in this way. When the question "Cui bono," who benefits, is asked of the 3 assassinations carried out by Inoue's band, the answer is clear: Emperor Hirohito. No longer is Hirohito's power circumscribed by the party-based cabinets of Taisho democracy. Now the political direction of the country is solely in Hirohito's hands and those of his close advisors, both civilian and increasingly military. While the prime minister can still make policy recommendations to the emperor, his major role is to implement the imperial policies he is given. When Konoe could no longer faithfully carry out Hirohito's policies, he resigned on 16 October 1941, for it was clear to him that by then Hirohito supported the military's plan for a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Konoe was opposed to war with the U.S. because he knew Japan was bound to lose. Inoue's ability to carry out secret operations as a spy had been proven in China. When Tanaka invited Inoue to meet him, they discussed the formation of a band of youth for the purpose of, quote, launching a rebellion, unquote. The goal was the extermination of communist ideology and the eradication of corruption both within political parties and among Zaibatsu leaders. Tanaka said to Inoue, quote, I will be 83 this year, but I still have the physical and mental strength to cut down 3 to 5 men. Do your best, unquote. From the outset, Tanaka clearly supported Inoue's terrorist plans. It is equally clear that Tanaka was not the only powerful man with a direct connection to the emperor who supported Inoue. Toyama certainly did too, as well as whoever it was that arranged for the replacement of the first chief judge, thereby garnering major public support for Inoue and his band's allegedly patriotic assassinations. And the question remains, how did Toyama know that Inoue would only have to serve 3 years of his sentence? While both Tokugawa, Yoshichika, and Konoe appealed to Hirohito for the release of Inoue and his band members, it was the emperor who made the ultimate decision to release them. The decision to erase Inoue's entire terrorist conviction must also have been agreed to by the emperor. Furthermore, for a former terrorist to be hired as a live-in advisor to a prime minister is likely a development without parallel in Japanese, if not world history. And although it may appear counterintuitive, Inoue stated that he was prepared to kill Japan's military leaders in the event of a successful military coup, something that seems to fly in the face of everything we know about military involvement in the Showa restoration movement. Finally, Inoue's presence as a live-in advisor to Konoe served to prevent the prime minister's assassination by those ultranationalists who feared that Konoe was willing to accept U.S. conditions for avoiding war. It can be said that by hiring Inoue, Konoe was fighting fire with fire. Probably the most surprising clue I've presented is Inoue's declaration that he and his band intended to kill the military leaders associated with a successful coup. To understand why he said this, we need to understand what the Showa restoration was about. even though its details remain fuzzy. First, it meant all political power would be restored to the emperor, who, as the sacred benevolent father of the Japanese people, would undertake major reforms, including land redistribution, suppression of the zaibatsu, and the elimination of corrupt politicians. Yet, military coup leaders were aware that Hirohito was not sympathetic to these reforms. Thus, if necessary, they were prepared to replace Hirohito with his younger brother, Prince Chichibu. Hirohito was aware of this danger and therefore, I suggest, was determined to crush the young officers' uprising of February 1936. For his part, Inoue and his band had only one goal: restoration of complete political power to Emperor Hirohito. Inoue would not allow anyone to impose their will on the emperor, even the military. If there was a conspiracy, any of the four names above could have been involved. It is entirely possible that more than one of them was involved. Each of them had close connections with Hirohito, though of course that doesn't prove that the emperor was directly involved in the plot. The emperor could, for example, have simply established the right atmosphere for ultranationalist plots like Inoue's to take place. We know, for example, that up until the young officers' uprising of February 1936, that when the leaders of the many failed ultranationalist plots were tried in Japanese courts, they always received surprisingly lenient sentences. This too could not have happened without the wishes of powerful elements in Japanese legal and government circles. Yet, I would be the first to admit I have no definitive proof of the emperor's personal involvement in any of this. That said, I need to introduce Marquis Tokugawa Yoshichika. Like so many powerful families in Japanese history, from the Fujiwara family onwards, the Tokugawa family or clan didn't simply vanish from history at the time of the Meiji Restoration. Like Konoe, Tokugawa was a member of the upper house of peers and was able to meet Hirohito privately in his palace lab at any time due to their shared interest in biology. Despite being a member of the aristocracy, Yoshichika was a major funder of ultranationalist activities from the 1920s onwards. He had at least one meeting with Inoue following the latter's release from prison in 1940 and invited him to participate in a plot in support of the Imperial Navy's strategic plans. Nevertheless, Tokugawa was never charged for his involvement in illegal ultranationalist activities. At this point, I'd like to pause for a moment in order to ask any participant who would like to share what you would have done had you been in my position. Would you have merely hinted at the possibility of a conspiracy? Would you have written that you were convinced there was a conspiracy, even if you couldn't prove it definitively? Or would you have simply ignored the question altogether? The floor is yours. Who would like to comment first? Any takers? Okay, anybody like to comment? What would you have done if you'd been in my place? I see there's another Brian out there. What, Brian Sweet, what do you think? Or Drew or Richard or anybody?
I'll jump in.
All right.
I'll turn my camera on. Hi. Yeah, I would continue straightforward ahead with the conspiracy notion based on what I know about the relationship between the ultra-right and the government at this time period. So I would feel fairly confident in pursuing this line of inquiry, I would say.
Would you dare to use the word?
That's probably a more difficult question. Perhaps I'd be more euphemistic, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, what do you know about the period that suggests that what I'm saying is aligns with what you know about it?
Well, I also study this incident, but from the perspective of no honshigi. So I come
All right.
to
Yes.
yes. So I come to this looking more at the Tachibana Kozaburo, and so just to see that there is a very strong web of connections between a lot of players.
Yes, and Inoue, as you may know, was also a confidant of Tachibana as well.
Yes, yes.
Yes, so they are all kind of mixed together, as it were. But the question is, how high does it go up? I mean, you can argue, the argument can be made that these people were just doing this on their own, so to speak. But then when you look at the support they had, I think that's when we begin to realize there has to be someone behind, someone or ones behind what's going on, especially when they're talking about funding these folks.
Yes, I've also looked there. They have some also regional politicians in Ibaraki as well, I think. So
yes, that's true. Right. Okay. Anybody else want to jump in?
I'm Jan
Yes.
Schmidt from
Yes,
University in Belgium. So I'm just wondering if still you shouldn't be a bit cautious. No? I mean, yes, you have these connections. Obviously, you have Toyama. This is access to the emperor, but it's obviously it's empirically difficult to prove knowledge. Yeah, but if you, for instance, see contemporary right-wing networks, no? And right now in Germany, for instance, we have a problem in the military and so forth. So isn't it also very often that you have these structural conditions? You mentioned Maruyama, no? So you have these right-wing from below, you have the Nippon Shimbun and all these networks around. And these people, it seems to me, very often are kind of roaring about possible assassinations. They're talking, but shying away from the last step, and then let people like Inoue do the dirty job. And it's not... I think it might maybe also valuable to talk more about the structural enabling spaces. Now, Ariel, for instance, mentioned also even down to local politics, and I would be a bit like hesitant to immediately discern there is a direct one or two or a small. It's possible, obviously, you're right, but it's from the evidence you have, it's not discernible, no? And very often I think terrorism is opportunistically. You could see this, for instance, really in the last years in examples of right-wing populist movement, and then very often these lonely terrorists, they feel enabled and they feel called upon, but then if you really look, there's no real immediate conspiracy, no? And there's kind of a mental conspiracy, basically. So it's both possible and might be even convoluted. So
yes, that's entirely possible. So I actually, as you'll see, I'm going to share what I actually said. I didn't use the word conspiracy. Today, I thought I would throw out the word conspiracy just to get people interested. Okay. Anybody else have a comment?
May I come in?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think my concern would be that you could say that the storytelling so far is a bit cinematic, in as far as you can, if you're making a film, you can make it look more of a conspiracy because the camera is focusing on particular individuals and not looking elsewhere. So I've looked at this incident from a completely different aspect and tempted to see a very different conspiracy, but more based on what people are fearing, which is something you haven't actually talked about yet.
Right. So could you talk more about your aspect or what your view
Well,
of this?
I'll let you go on. I think I'd rather you go carried on, and maybe I'll chip in again at the end.
Okay. Yes, we will have a lot of chance for discussion at the end. So this was just a little taste, a little dip to see if you're listening out there. Okay. So, folks, we are going to have another chance for an extended discussion. So let me continue here at this point. Okay. Now I have to get the screen sharing back here to the full screen. Let's see here. Okay, slideshow. Hopefully. All right, we got back, but we're going to have to, let me see. Maybe I can go, no, I can't go that way. Oh, okay, so that we don't want it, as interesting as that is, we don't want to go there. So let me go back here. Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to zip through this whole thing again and we'll get to the end very quickly, I hope. Okay, I learned something from today here. All right, so what would you do? And now we go. All right, so next slide. This is what I did do. This is how I tried to deal with it in the matter in the book. Let me express the hope that future historians will continue to investigate this matter, especially any role the emperor may have played in Konoe's actions or with pre-war ultranationalists in general. However, it may well be that even if the emperor or his advisors did play a role, it is now so well hidden that it will never be known. Needless to say, contact with terrorists is not something Hirohito or his advisors are likely to have left a record of. Additionally, if such contact did occur, it would have been indirect, done with the aid of political figures like Konoe or fixers like Toyama Mitsuru and Tokugawa Yoshichika. By nature, fixers too don't leave records of their activities. Thus, readers are left to ponder these questions and reach their own conclusions. So you can see I kind of punted or chickened out, whatever you want to call it. Okay. So with that, my presentation is at an end, and I open the floor for questions and comments, but criticisms and rebuttals are also welcome. I'm anxious to hear, and I heard a little bit, but I'm anxious to hear more, what other scholars make of the information I presented. So fire away, but first, please let me know who you are. Okay. So, especially, yes.
All right,
I have
a question.
All right.
Okay, my name is Yasuko Tsukane. I'm actually art historian, so I'm very much not in your field, but I'm also specializing in 20th century. My question is that, I'm sorry, I just don't remember the person who had just spoke to you. You know, it's like cinematic, and it's, you know, as a narrative, it's very attractive. It's fascinating. You know, you may not have the concrete proof, but my question is that if we listen to your story as a very interesting narrative, who are the protagonists of your narratives? Are you focusing on the terrorists themselves or the fixers, or you're kind of giving equal importance to those parties and try to figure out their relationships? I think it really depends on how you frame the whole narrative, and I think it, you know, I think it, the whole sort of the focus and analysis will be changed.
Yes. Well, I suppose we have to make a difference between my book, where the focus was on the Zen connection to these terrorists, and so in a certain sense, you know, what I presented today was just a bonus because that was not the purpose of my book. The purpose of my book was simply, I wanted folks to understand, because I've written 2 other books about the Zen connection to war in wartime Japan. And I wanted to show basically Westerners that not only was Zen closely connected with the Japanese military, but that it was even connected with domestic assassinations. But in the course of writing the book, and especially of reading Inoue's biography and the testimony in court, it just simply became so interesting to see who these other actors were. And so that's when I began, you know, on my own, in a sense, trying to decide well, who was Toyama Mitsuru and who was Tokugawa Yoshichika. I think Tokugawa Yoshichika in particular is hardly comes into play in any of the books that I've read on modern Japanese history.
Mm-hmm.
But he's really a fascinating figure because he's a member of the aristocracy, of course, and yet we know, for example, one of the things we know about him was that in 1931 there were 2 attempted military coups, and the first they were carried out by what was called the Sakura Kai, which was a group of young officers. Kind of, they were the preliminary expression of the young officers' uprising of 1936. But at any rate, when they needed money, he actually sold gold bars and gave them at least 200,000 yen, and as much as, depends on your source, either 200 to 500,000 yen for them to launch their military coup. And that's fascinating in itself. But on top of that was the fact that he had, usually if you wanted to meet the emperor, even if you were a member of the aristocracy, it was a very long drawn out process to have an audience with the emperor. But he and the emperor were known to get together frequently in the emperor's palace biological lab, and that he could enter that way, you could say, through the back door of the palace, and they could meet privately. So, when you think about that, you think, how could he have been melting down gold bars to fund the Sakura Kai and meeting the emperor at the same time? And it beggars the imagination to imagine that the two of them never discussed what he was doing. And also, during World War II, he was posted as the civilian head of the Singapore military government, right? And his role was never questioned for any of his support of these ultranationalist groups. And so when you see that, then suddenly it seems, can I prove it? No, I can prove the circumstances around it. But and then you see with Toyama Mitsuru, from 1881 all the way, and here is what it's interesting. What do these people do for Hirohito? For example, what Toyama Mitsuru did was that, as you may know, Emperor Hirohito, before he got married, he was looking for a wife, and he found he was introduced. Found Nagako, and he wanted, apparently he had a romantic interest in her. It wasn't just an arranged marriage. He had because what the Genro, the senior leaders, were against the marriage. Why? Because there was a history of color blindness in Nagako's family. All right? And they didn't want to have a possibility of an heir to the throne who was physically disabled in any way. Probably that has something to do with the fact that Emperor Taisho was apparently also either physically or mentally or both disabled in some way. But at any rate, they didn't want to have that happen. And so what happens is that Hirohito calls on Toyama to terrorize the Genro into allowing him to marry Nagako. You probably never heard this story, but it's a well-known story. All right, and so you can see at that, here is a clear incident in which Emperor Hirohito calls on the ultranationalists to do him, as it were, a personal favor. All right, and it doesn't end there. Remember, I mentioned that Count Tanaka Mitsuaki also did favors for Emperor Hirohito. One of the interesting stories there was that after Hirohito and Nagako got married, they had children. She had a number of children, but they were all girls. And of course, you couldn't have a girl emperor. And so the problem was that Tanaka was called on to find a concubine for the emperor who could have a boy child. And so Tanaka duly went through a whole long list of people and found at least, I don't know that he found just one person, but he narrowed the list down to some appropriate young women. But it was just at that time that Nagako got pregnant and she had a boy. And so that solved the problem of a successor. So, I mean, that's the kind of close connections the emperor had with ultranationalists, if you will, or with the imperial household, with people who are clearly involved with the ultranationalist movement. Does that prove that Hirohito was involved? No. But does it suggest that he could have easily become involved? I think it does. Any comment? Your response?
Can I reply?
All right.
Hi, Brian. This is
Yes.
David Palmer from Australia.
Yes, David. Yes, David.
You know, we knew each other in Adelaide.
Yes,
I'm in
indeed.
Melbourne now, in lockdown again.
You're where
6
now?
weeks.
Well,
we're in lockdown. Yeah, you know, with the virus.
But where?
Anyway, in
Where
Melbourne.
Are you? In Melbourne. All right. Yes.
Yeah. Just a couple of points. I really like the way you, in your latest work, as well as your earlier work, really focus on this ideology and the connection of Zen to the rise of, you know, what we would have to call imperial fascism.
Yes.
But I would raise the question that Jan raised earlier, which is the problem of evidence. Okay, when you bring up the Reichstag fire,
right?
Shearer is not a good source. The best source is Richard J. Evans.
Okay.
He's got a whole chapter on the Reichstag fire in his first volume of the Third Reich trilogy.
All right.
The Third Reich comes to power.
And you say his name was? I'm sorry, Richard what?
Richard J. Evans.
All right.
He's one of the best historians of the Third Reich in terms of looking at it in a holistic, you know, comprehensive way.
What does he say about the fire?
Well, he says that the evidence that the Nazis did it was basically fabricated by the communists, and there's very solid empirical evidence of that. It was a convenient argument, but it was basically the anarchists. But obviously, they use that as a pretext to, you know, destroy, you know, all of the other parties, the communists, socialists, everybody. So what I would do, see, my approach would be, I think you're onto something with a conspiracy, but I don't think that the Reichstag fire is necessarily the best comparison, okay? Right. The other thing is that in the assassination that you talk about, as well as the February 36 coup by the junior officers, to me that seems to be part of this, you know how you have these factions in the military, the control faction, the Imperial Way faction. Yeah. And the control faction really wants to just take power, okay? So this, I think, raises the problem of divisions within these elite elements that are controlling society, whether it's the army, whether it's in the Zaibatsu, and also in the political figures that are, you know, like Konoe and others that are maneuvering through the imperial household and all of this. And I think that, like, again, taking up Jan's point, I think there are structural issues involved in the nature of imperial fascism, how it comes to power, where you almost have to go beyond these personalities. And I'd say, number one, to prove a conspiracy, you got to hit more empirical evidence, you know, of army records. Yeah. And, you know, one thing about Japan, they're like the Germans, okay? You know, you think everything's disappeared, right? You can always find documents, okay? Yeah. I've been searching for years for documents on Korean forced labor, and we uncovered, you know, 30,000 names connected to Mitsubishi and other miners. Mining operations that the Zaibatsu had. We found this in Nagasaki, you know, local people. It's
Yeah.
around, okay? These
Yeah.
documents are around. You just have to dig for it. It's there somewhere. And so I would say, just my final comment is that I think it makes more sense to look at the power structures, at what the army is doing, like what are the interests of the Zaibatsu? Like there's a Zaibatsu top executive that's assassinated. Well, what are the power maneuvers there? Because they're a major force. Once the
Yes.
war economy
Oh,
gets,
absolutely.
they're it.
Yeah.
Anyway, those are my thoughts, and it's really great to see you again, Brian.
Thank you. Okay, let me a couple of responses about the Reichstag fire. There was just a reason, and I forgot to write it down, David, but there was a book that just came out. I believe his name was Brown, but I'm not certain about that. But in his book, I looked it up, and he said that there is some new evidence, and he did, unfortunately, the guy, at least on Amazon.com, you can peek into a book. I haven't bought it yet. But anyway, I peeked into the book, and he said there's new evidence that suggests that, in fact, the Nazis did it. But he didn't, the part that Amazon.com allowed me to peek at didn't have the evidence. All right. So, and I only saw that last week. The other thing that I thought was interesting, though, about that is that Hermann Goering definitely did say in 1942 that, in fact, he boasted that if anybody wanted to know about the Reichstag fire, they should ask him because he said it. So he stated that in 1942. However, after the war, when he was then, in prison, then he claimed that he had never had any part of it. So I guess, it becomes a question of which statement by Goering's was the truth. But of course, in that sense, what I'm really, I suppose, the one thing I think about the Reichstag fire is that we don't know, as you said, we don't know for sure, even though there seems to be evidence, but there's other evidence. And in the same fashion, we don't know for sure that Emperor Hirohito was involved. There seems to be some evidence that he could have been or that he was. But you remember the end of my, the way I covered it in the book, David, was to say, I'm hoping future historians like you will continue to look for the evidence one way or the other. So in that sense, David, I think I covered, I was sufficiently, I wanted to be provocative and say, let's look at it. But one of the things, David, I think that's really worthwhile in this discussion is whether there was a conspiracy or not. What I really think is when Inoue, who was Konoe's advisor, says that once Konoe took over the premiership in 1937, that from that point, the emperor called the shots. The emperor made the policy, and the prime minister, in this case Konoe, carried out his policy.
Can I just add to that? Yeah. I think that's right, because I think February 36 was the turning point. I think that was the key thing. You get the control faction. It's like the Night of the Long Knives. They get rid of the crazies in the far right, and they get the consolidators. Okay, yes. And they in turn also can work with the conservatives and the Zaibatsu. Yes. They're not threatening the emperor, all of that. Because, part of the February coup was, it was an attack on the imperial palace, right?
That's right. And well, not only that, and I think that's what's so interesting about Inoue, and that's what's so interesting about the Zen connection too. And that is this. Inoue, the Zen people, if you think about the Nichiren people in Japanese history, they've always been a voice, an important voice, but they've always shot themselves in the foot because they've always had a plan. They've had demands. You've got to get rid of all of these other sects and listen. And Nichiren said, and only listen to me. I'm the only one who can save Japan, blah, blah, blah. And Tanaka Chikaku was like that too. The Nichiren Shugi movement, which you're probably familiar with, they also had that. But the Zen folks never had their own plan. They were always willing to put themselves in the service of whoever the powerful people were that called upon them. And so here's Inoue saying that he had the Kodo-ha Imperial Way faction won, had they succeeded, he and his band would have killed them at their first Gozen Kaigi, their first meeting in front of the emperor. Why? Because we haven't talked about this, but I think it's really important to bring in National Socialism at this point. The Kodo-ha people, the Imperial Way faction, wanted, and Kitaiki, and the Imperial Ways, they thought National Socialism should be imposed on Japan. And that would have meant, that would have forced the emperor to somehow do something, take some action against the Zaibatsu. And that's clearly not what he wanted he would do. And in fact, that Sakura Kai that I mentioned in 1931, they already had a clear plan. Their plan was they were going to force Hiroshita, if this coup had been successful, they would force him to employ National Socialism, to make it the ideology of the state. And if he wouldn't do that, they were prepared to replace him with Chichibu, who was a supporter of the Kodo-ha, or the Imperial Way faction. Hiroshita had to have known that. He had to know how dangerous his position was. And when the Tosei-ha won out, that must have been a big relief, because as you pointed out just now, they were quite willing to work with the Zaibatsu and maintain the status quo as long as they could take over the military end of things, right? So, but anyway, the point I wanted to make really is that thanks to my friend here, Herbert Bix, I still meet people, and I wonder if there's anybody in the audience who feels this, that there's still people who imagine that Emperor Hiroshito was this puppet, was just a puppet of the military, and that they were really in control. I hope we can lay that really to rest, because I think it plays in, David, to the American, Australian, and Japanese historical view that the emperor was innocent. And I'm maintaining, as Bix has maintained, that he was there and part of it, and in fact directing it from the very beginning to the very end. What do you think, David?
May I chip in?
Oh,
I'm sorry. May I?
All right, Brian. Yes.
Yes.
But I want to hear from you, David. I want to hear your reaction. Please go ahead, Brian.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I'll be very brief. I agree with you, but I think that, and I certainly think Bix is right. Brilliant biography, all of that. Hirohito was guilty, but it's bigger. As Jan says, there's structural issues involved. There's big power involved. In the same way, if you look at the Third Reich, yes, it's Hitler, but there's the, big business, the army office.
IG Farben, et cetera, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, I'm sorry to, let's hear other people.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Brian?
Yeah, I'm Brian Chen. I'm joining in from Hong Kong.
All right.
I have long admired your work. I actually work on the radical right in the nationalist China.
Yes.
I wanted to perhaps stir the conversation to a slightly different direction, which is what I think you're very good in sort of dropping bombshells, right, with Sakura Kai and so on. I mean, it really touches on what we want, as historians, what we want to do with our work. For example, I think in Chinese history, in a period that I study, one of the biggest scandal, perhaps, is whether Chiang Kai-shek was actually fighting the Japanese. Was he, at some point, really want to collaborate with Japan? Yes. And if you sort of were able to prove conclusively, which we can't do at this point, I think, not yet, that he collaborated was willing to collaborate with the Japanese, then of course it would become big news and be reported around in the media. But in many situations, the developments were more opaque and nuanced. So what happens usually, and what happened in this case was there's a scholar in Taiwan who wrote a long book about how the Chongqing government actually had negotiations with representatives of the Japanese government in order to sort of reach some sort of peace between the two regimes. And then he ended up writing this long book, 600 pages, published by a minor university press in Taiwan, and nobody pays attention. So I think because you ask historians what to do when you see these hints, right? Yes, you see the fingerprints all over the place. And I was going to say, what sort of audience you have in mind in writing your book? I mean, are you going to drop a bombshell? Or are you hinting at directions that scholars would want to follow, leads that scholars would like to follow in their future research? I mean, it seems you slant towards the latter, but I think it's also in your scholarship has sort of this sort of newsworthy, media-worthy dimension, and I just wanted whether you attempted also to do that as well.
Well, that's a good question, but I would repeat, in a sense, Brian, what I said before. I didn't intend to write a history book, so this is really what I intended, what I wanted, what I'm really concerned about as a scholar of Buddhism, and as a Buddhist priest, and as a practitioner, is the way that Buddhism has been used in Asia for millennia, and is even being used today in Myanmar to promote violence, to justify violence. Right? And in general, I think that people in the West, especially those people who have been drawn to Buddhism as I was by, for example, D.T. Suzuki, all right, that they still are very naive, and they imagine that Buddhism is this very peaceful religion that, unlike the Abrahamic religions, has always practiced peace. And what I'm trying to show here in my first two books, Zen at War and Zen War Stories, I showed the role, the close connection between Japanese Zen leaders and the Japanese military during World War II. And in this book, what was of my interest, was the fact that it was not even the Japanese military, but here they were justifying. They actually, I didn't share it with you, but that Yamamoto Genpo, who I mentioned, actually testified on Inoue Nisho's behalf, and he said that if anyone tries to destroy social harmony, the Buddha says that they should be killed. And so I wanted to get that message out. And of course, I did show in the slide about how the assassins actually meditated. They sat and meditated in order to gain the presence of mind, the ability to carry out the assassinations. So what I'm trying to do, by the purpose of my book, was to give a warning to Western Buddhists: be careful, because meditation has been, and can be used to accomplish violence, to justify violence. And in my book, I mentioned, for example, that in the Iraq War, there are now American Zen Buddhist chaplains conducting meditation sessions for American soldiers before they go out to kill Iraqis. That's hardly known, but it's on YouTube. You can take a look at it. All right. And so this is just a warning. So the historical part of this, Brian, that I'm giving tonight, I wanted, it's kind of a side issue, but I think it's a fascinating issue, especially because I found in America, so many Americans still believe the American myth that Hirohito was an innocent party and that it was the military were the bad guys. But I would like to say one thing to you, Brian, too, and that I was fascinating also in learning about Toyama Mitsuru to see how strongly he had supported Sun Yat-sen at the time of the Republican Revolution. And apparently the reason he supported him, and I'd like your information too, was because he thought that if the ultra-right in Japan thought that if they supported the Republican Revolution, that in return, once the revolution was successful, they would turn Manchuria over to Japan. Is that your understanding, Brian?
Oh, that's the first time I've heard of this about Manchuria. Of course, with perhaps other scholars would have more perfect, more information on that. But he sounds like a Kitaiki sort of person in many ways. I mean, there were of course a lot of the Lonins who were involved with Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen was also very happy to work with them. Yeah. But if I can add another point, the intellectual legworks that you have sort of described in your previous two books really it was the biggest attraction as far as I'm concerned. I mean, even without this sort of behind the scene maneuvers that you have described to us tonight, it would seem plausible that they would be working together. I mean, for example, in Chinese history, I don't have to really prove whether like Chiang Kai-shek wanted to collude with Japan. He obviously had pro-Japanese sympathies in his writings.
Yeah. And
also a lot of his senior cadres also had Japanese sympathies or sympathy for national, so the fascism that the Japanese were going through, even though they were fighting the Japanese from Chongqing.
That's right.
So you don't have, I as far as I'm concerned as a historian, I don't really need more persuading with whether there was a controversy or not. But I appreciate that. I mean, I just want to add this, and I have to apologize. I might have to go a bit early.
Well, I would just respond, that I think I hope you can develop this, Brian, this thesis, because I'm certain, there is that old expression in English, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
And it's very clear that for Chiang Kai-shek, I think, his chief enemy was the communists. And the chief enemy of Japan was also the communists. And so I'm certain that in that sense, the two of them, if they could have worked out something, they would have worked it out, because they could have, it's clear that until he was imprisoned by the young general, that he would not fight against the Japanese. And I think that's why, isn't that why the revolution was lost, was because Chiang Kai-shek lost the mantle of Chinese nationalism because he would not initially fight against the Japanese. And the people wanted to fight against the Japanese. So I'm certain that you're right, that the two would have worked. And in fact, Inoue, one thing about Inoue Nisho was that he approached his Zen master, and they were going to parachute into Chongqing during the war to have some kind, to affect some kind of peaceful relation, or even an alliance between Japan and China. And that was even during the 1940s. So as late as the 1940s, there were those elements in Japan that wanted to form an alliance with Chiang Kai-shek against the communists. That's for sure.
Right, exactly. But then the other side, I'm taking too much time. But then even intellectually, even while they were fighting,
Yes.
the senior nationalists were attracted to Showa Japan.
Yes.
民國民社先錯多言.
Yes.
The same movement with the same
That's right.
characters
Yeah.
were were put in place in national Chiang Kai-shek controlled
Yes.
parts of China in 1939.
Yes.
So
they were peas in a pod. I
Right,
remember that famous statement by Chiang Kai-shek. He said, "Fascism holds the future of China."
well, thank you very much, though. But it's very nice to be able to meet you virtually.
All right, great.
Bye bye.
I hope we again. Bye bye. And we have some other people.
Brian?
Yes, sir. Please jump in.
Right, Brian. Richard from Auckland University.
Yes, Richard.
Richard.
Yes, Richard.
Hello. Yes. Two things. One comment, and then you talked about Inoue Nisho saying the emperor was closely connected to Konoe. Konoe's been groomed by the emperor since 1919, or by the top imperial advisor since 1919, to be the man to take the job. So there is that intimate connection. But when I used to teach about this period, two crucial words were in the literature, and I always thought that they should have been used not just about the military, but about life in the institutional structures in Japan. And that's what makes conspiracy theory so difficult to convert into conspiracy evidence. And that is Gekokujo and Harange.
Yes.
Gekokujo means, of course, that people who are underneath push their superiors to do things which the people underneath think are more valuable than their superiors currently think is possible. And then harange, of course, is the ability of people to sit through a meeting and not actually say anything when their superiors possibly go, and that's about all they do.
Yeah.
And people who are doing the gekokujoing are saying, right, we've got the support from someone higher up. They don't actually have to document it. They don't have to give any evidence for it. And of course, as with any of these things, they can deny it, and deny their responsibility if it goes wrong. And that seems to me a crucial part of maybe all countries, but very clearly in Japan in the 1930s. And that means that for your job of proving that a conspiracy happened with any evidence, that becomes incredibly difficult, because basically the people who are in the jaw position, the above position, are not going to say, yes, we gave you permission. Say we were silent on that. I mean, we know these liaison conferences where the emperor didn't speak, and because they'd all supposedly reached a consensus in front of him, then that was taken as the emperor having spoken. And obviously, that the emperor spoke twice, as far as we can clearly see, in February 1936 and in August 1945, when he actually pushed the discussion in a direction which wasn't just harange, it was actual. So I wish you well, and I've watched the books developing over the time since you've been at Auckland, were at Auckland, and it's very hard to prove conspiracy when one side of the possible perpetrators have the ability to say nothing and yet give approval.
That's right. Well, I of course I agree with you, but I would just say in response though that first of all, one of the things that Herbert Bix's book has done, I think, is to show us that before you have the Gozen Kaigi, before the emperor sits there supposedly as a neutral observer, that he's already let his advisors have already informed the participants prior to the Gozen Kaigi of what the emperor's wishes really are, so that he wasn't just waiting for them to present him with something. He was an active participant in forming that consensus that appeared to develop at the Gozen Kaigi. But of course, how active he was in all of that, that's something we all have to debate. I've lost your photograph, your picture there, but at any rate, you're still there, aren't you? Are you still there, David? Okay.
Are you asking me, Brian?
Yeah, I lost your video feed. That's all.
Oh, okay. No, I'm still here.
All right. Good. No, I'm sorry. The guy, my colleague
You're
from
looking for
Auckland.
Richard, right?
Richard, yes, Richard. I'm sorry. Are you still there? I can't see you anymore. There you are. All right, now I see you back. Okay, but I can't hear you. Can you unmute? Can you hear me? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you. All right.
Sorry, my wife used the phone and that cut the link. Sorry.
All right. At any rate, so the other thing I'd say is this, Richard, is that of course, you're right, but there is, when you think about a terrorist being convicted and having his sentence, a life imprisonment, cut down. First of all, that somebody could say it was only be 3 years, but he was released after saying, and to have the entire conviction erased as if it had never happened. That takes, some very clear action. Somebody had to erase it, and then for him to be invited to work, to live in the Konoe's estate. I mean, those are things that are, or for Tokugawa Yoshichika to melt down gold bars to fund the Sakura Kai and so forth. These are not just harage or silent approval. I mean, these are very active interventions in what was going on at the time. And so I think in that sense that I agree with, and I hope nobody thinks that I'm trying to prove there was definitely a conspiracy. But what I do think is that these are at the very least, very concrete, tangible expressions of the possibility that there were very powerful people behind the scenes who were manipulating these events to their liking.
Yes, I'm very happy to agree with that.
I wonder a bit about so it's a bit the direction that Brian Tsui also asked. So, what does this mean a bit for our current scholarship in a way, of Japan? For instance, if you teach in the classroom survey histories. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is, of course, you have also this, I would say now in scholarship, academically powerful counter current led by people like Fred Dickinson, for instance, or Sandra Wilson, partially, I would say, and others, who time and again try to emphasize to say, well, you cannot read the 1920s and early 1930s only from their outcome. So that they basically make this point. It would be kind of unfair to the manifold possibilities of the interwar period to only read it by its outcome, by, let's call it imperial fascism indeed, and so forth, and the Second World War. As a German, I'm very cautious about these kind of readings, no?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but it is a problem, no? Because I think also what David mentioned is, so we have indeed what I also said. I think we should be very careful not to balance structural factors indeed, and larger networks and these small personal networks which try to take some kind of decisive action by these kind of conspiracies. But I wonder, and it's an open question, I wonder a bit if your warning also, including of course the misuse of Buddhism, is also important for younger scholars today, no? Because I don't want to go at all too much into contemporary politics, but if we see what's happened right now, no? The rise of populist authoritarian figures all over the world, and very clearly the usage of very brutal, very simple ways to grasp power, to get rid of the inhibitions posed by constitutions and so forth, by things you could call indeed conspiracies sometimes, of very small networks, sometimes, not always.
Yes.
But then again, very often based on a kind of, certainly not the same, but the kind of similar kind of developments of populist right-wing movements that seem to kind of enable these people in a very complex mutual relationship, no? Yeah. And so I'm just wondering, to put it simple, sometimes I wonder a bit if the younger generation, including myself, of historians of Japan, and in general of historians, didn't go a bit too far for instance, in going into methodologies or cultural studies and so forth. Our colleague here, I think Mrs. Tsuchikane, who is not here anymore, I think she asked you about your narrative, and then of course we all like our hate and white, which I do myself. You were also, there was this idea by David about the cinema, basically seeing this your narrative as a cinema.
By the way, let me interrupt you to say, I hope to see this as a film.
Can I jump in here with that quickly? It was a film.
One second, I just want to finish the thought.
Did you say? I'm sorry. You said it was a film.
Let's let Jan finish.
Go ahead.
Yeah, my point is, I see both positions. No, the problem is a bit. What if sometimes we just have very simple. Being myself somebody who more would write this in a structural way, who also sees the problem that we all have different perspectives, that are all narratives, and then hate and white, yes. But at the end of the day, sometimes you have brutal conspiracies, and I think if you see what's going on in the US, in Brazil, in the Philippines, in Turkey, and so forth, I just wonder if sometimes we lost a bit the ability, indeed, sometimes to be just kind of a bit criminological, as you were in this case, no?
Yeah.
And try to seek the simple evidence, because at the end of the head, if you look into a barrel of a pistol and somebody pulls the trigger, this is a rather simple narrative. You're killed. And sometimes, I'm just saying. So what does it mean? For instance, so that's basically to finish. So for our overall teaching of the interwar period again, with all the scholarship of the last decades, including yours, of course. So does this really your assumption that there might be really a hardcore, might have been a conspiracy, including up to the Showa emperor, even if you could prove it, what would it change really for the way we, in kind of overall survey narratives view this period? And then the second question is, if a bit provocatively, advocatus diaboli, if sometimes we should hear your warning in a way also, because I do think sometimes we over-complex narrate the things and overlook sometimes very brutal, simple political machinations, and that might be also a weakness of kind of progressive political ways to write even about the contemporary political situation at that point, whereas I think people on the right, in most cases, maybe sometimes also on the left, do not hesitate, indeed, if necessary, to resort to very simple but very effective, sometimes collusion and conspiracy. Sorry, so long comment, but sorry.
Okay, well, I have a very quick question for you, Jan, and that is, what is your take on the Reichstag fire?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you that you mentioned it. So I like Richard Evans, but as a German, I have mildly to object. There's a bit more of scholarship, maybe like 1,000 times more on the German side. And because this is obviously a long debate, no? And I would say that the current state of research in Germany is that because there was evidence later uncovered that there is still a lot of at least circumstantial evidence that this was indeed a conspiracy by the Nazis. For instance, there's protocols of an SR driver who drove Lübbe, the guy who put the fire there, the Dutch person, to the Reichstag and so forth. So I would say, and at least I think the consensus in German historiography would be that even if this was not an Einzeltäter, so single perpetrator, and this might have been a group of communists, but it doesn't really matter because it was opportunistically used in a way by kind of Nazi conspiracy to exploit this a lot. And there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that it was indeed planted by the Nazis. No? So that would be, and I think that's pretty solid in terms of scholarship from all sides. So Evans had a point for a certain time, but I think the latest evidence is a bit in his disfavor, to be honest. But yeah, that's I'm not a specialist in that, but from what I know from my studies, that's the case.
Okay, well let me say my big concern. In America today, of course, we've got the right-left cleavage is growing, and one of the things that I really find heartening is this willingness of Americans to finally go back and look with what I see as some degree of objectivity, even to Columbus himself and what he brought. All right. And so in that sense, one of the things that I look at from a contemporary point of view is that still, despite a book like Herbert Bix's, there is this belief that the emperor was an innocent bystander or a victim of the Japanese military. And in fact, in almost all of the books that we see today, we still use the word Japanese militarism. And I think that to use that word is to blind us to reality. It is to fall into the American establishment's myth that it was the Japanese military that was at fault, just as it would be to fall into a German myth that it was the German military that was at fault. And that if you could just get rid of the military or the bad military from that era, then everything would be fine. And that Japan now, today, because they have gotten rid of the bad military, is just fine, thanks to the American occupation and the democratization of Japan. And so I hope, one of the things that I'm hoping for, forget about the conspiracy. In one sense, that's a minor part of what I'm trying to say. What I'm really trying to say is that and I'm trying to back up with some further evidence, Bix's thesis that the emperor was in control the whole time. And once that, if we can get Americans and generally people in the West, I would like to appeal to everyone who's listening today to stop using the word Japanese militarism, because that plays into the hands of those people who want to blame the military. I think the proof, and this I feel there is proof for, that we can show the military carried out the dictates of the emperor. Now, if that's true, if that can be true, then we can begin to see that the current close relationship between Japan and the United States, designed to suppress China, is really a continuation of the anti-communist crusade that not only the US, but that Japan had been part of from the beginning of the 20th century. And that it's only an extension. And it's only going to become worse as the relationship that Japan is going to become even more pliant, even more of a, I won't even say a recipient, because people like Abe, he is the grandson of Kishi Nobusuke, who was the economic czar of Manchuria, who was responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Manchurian and Chinese laborers in Japanese coal mines, etc. These people continue to be in charge of Japan today, and they will work hand in glove with the United States to ensure that China is suppressed. And so I think this is one of the big, I see this as the beginning of trying to unravel, to re-examine America's role, especially in post-war Japan. But I'll stop here, give other people. I was interested in that comment about there's a movie.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess just also kind of maybe looking at it in the post-war, the movie is the 1969 movie Nihon Ansatsu Hiro.
Yes, okay.
And so it ends with the longest and ending scene is of the Ketsumeidan Jiken, where Onumachol is played by Chiba Shinichi.
Yes, very good.
And it really it plays on the emotion of the impoverished rural boy who can't afford to marry, kind of into these notions of the rural poverty that you started with. But I think also an interesting thing about this movie is that the actual Onumachol came and watched it filmed. So he watched actually the cinematic recreation of this event, while he was being portrayed by one of the biggest stars in Japan at this time too. And so I think that, that's an interesting movie and how it puts together this history of Japanese assassination. And I was also interested that you didn't, Inoue Nisho's autobiography was also published, in the post-war too in 53.
Yes.
I was surprised you didn't mention the title of it yet, because it does have such a
here it is. he wanted to call it Isatsu Taisho, but his publishers didn't like that, so they ended up with being Ichinin Isatsu. But the Isatsu Taisho is a Buddhist phrase. And by the way, could I ask, do you have, I'm very glad you mentioned that film, because that's an important, I really am fascinated by the film as well. Do you happen to have any information that you could share with me on Onumachol's reaction to watching the film?
I think it was said like that he wept.
Yes.
You know, that it was very emotional for him to.
Do you know where I could find that?
I'll email you later.
I would be very grateful.
That
I would be very grateful.
Because
but of course, that was yes, it has been that part. But did you notice a couple of things? Number one, that they made Inoue was a Nichiren Gyoja. I don't remember if you remember those words, but they introduced Inoue as a Nichirenist, which he never was. And in Japanese history books, they all Japanese history books have it wrong.
Yeah, that was actually one of my questions for you, because when I, like I said, I come to this from looking at agrarianism. So I spend a lot more time looking at, which has its own very compelling narrative of why they had the particular treatment that they received during the trial, which was that the narrative of the poor farm boys who were acting to raise awareness for rural poverty was a very powerful narrative, and that also fueled the petitions for leniency for them as well. So we see a lot of maybe various cinematic narratives around these incidents that could be also quite persuasive in their way.
And do you remember that when Onumachol in the film, before he goes to assassinate, before he goes to shoot Inoue, all he does is chant Namamyo Horengekyo, and there is a kakejuku, a scroll of Namamyo Horengekyo on the wall, and he recites that, and then he picks up the gun and begins to load it. But in fact, what he said was exactly what I posed, that he had been meditating, and that it was after his entering into samadhi, which is never a part of, that's not part of the Nichiren tradition. It was entering into samadhi that gave him the ability, the conviction that he would be able to carry out the assassination. So that for whatever reason, and I have in my book, if you'll read my book, you'll find I go into a very long story about why it was that this was presented as a Nichiren incident rather than a Zen incident. But I think you can see already from what I presented, it's the information I have is incontrovertible, that it was Zen that was at the heart of it.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that. And I guess my last question too is, Toyama Mitsuru's son was also involved.
Oh yes, yes he was. He was the one who ran. The son was the one who had the martial arts hall, which was right next to Toyama Mitsuru's home. And Inoue Nisho actually hid out in the martial arts hall before he was arrested. And of course, he was never arrested. That's another story. It was rumored the police were thinking about arresting him, and he was told that, and then he decided to turn himself in, as it were. So it's a fascinating, at a human level, it's very fascinating. But what I would hope to do in a film is, I'm glad you mentioned that film, because it is the core, a kernel of what could be done with that long story.
I guess my last question there would be, because this is a post-war film too, especially in '69, so it's coming out at the same time as maybe the rise of like D.T. Suzuki style Buddhism in the West. So would you connect this kind of narrative coming from Japan regarding Buddhism and these events, or kind of avoiding the relationship between Buddhism and these events, to the maybe to the kind of like cultural post-war cultural Japan is no longer a threat, something like that, this type of?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I can't give you a definite answer. There is certainly a post-war narrative in Japan that to the extent that religion, particularly Buddhism, was involved in extremism, that it was all Nichiren type, especially because, you know, Tanaka Chikaku and the Nichiren Shugi was a very powerful force, and it had its supporters among some of the top military men. And so there's a kind of just, I think, I would tend to think of it more as a natural expression of the general Japanese belief that if there was Buddhist extremism, that its source came from the Nichiren tradition. But secondly, it's also true, if you remember that film, that when Inoue Nisho at his temple, when he goes to offer to recite some sutras, he does it in front of a statue of Nichiren, and that statue is there today. But that makes it look, to anybody who would look at it from to look at that temple even today, they would imagine, because you have a statue of Nichiren on the altar, that it must be a Nichiren temple, which it never was. But of course, the reason Nichiren was there was because Nichiren, of all of the Japanese priests, Nichiren has been historically the closest one that was that you can identify with what we today call Japanese nationalism. And so it was natural that he would be used as a focal point. Plus, the last thing I would mention there is that the Lotus Sutra, because they did recite the mantra Namamyo Horen Geikyo, and Japanese in general imagine that Lotus Sutra, that mantra, is exclusively Nichiren, but it was Tendai. And like so many, you know, what happened in Japan was the Tendai sect was the mother of all of the Kamakura sects, and each one of them took something different out of it. Nichiren happened to take out that mantra, but the Lotus Sutra itself remained part of all of the sects to this day. It's the most important. So, but Japanese will tend to believe that if you recite that sutra, you must be Nichiren. But that's getting pretty detailed. If you read my book, I really do spell it out very carefully. But I am very interested if you have that information about Onuma and his reaction. Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody who hasn't spoken, especially? Comments?
I think there's one question from Simon.
Yeah, may I jump in?
Yes.
My connection is a little bit dodgy, so I might just use audio. Is that okay?
Oh, of course.
Okay. Could I just bring the discussion back to Jan's very interesting comments and questions? I actually am doing a project where I'm doing like a history of the incidents, and I teach that, and I do that with Japanese students at a Japanese university. So perhaps I'm a little bit more sensitive to the challenges and the difficulties of this project. I couldn't help but noticing, first of all, I want to thank you for your scholarship. I've spent a lot of time, maybe more than I'd like to admit, in Rinzai temples all around Japan, but thank you for your scholarship. What I wanted to say, though, perhaps this may sound a little bit direct and harsh, but in many ways, Bergamini, in 1973, went over this ground in a very, very large book called the Yamamoto Conspiracy.
Yes.
And his influence is still strong. You know, recently, Francis Pike's Hirohito's War has echoes that Bergamini first introduced in that sort of Yamamoto Conspiracy. I guess the question I'd like to ask to you is the same one that I'd like to ask to Bergamini if he was still alive, is that, you know, do you really think that, you know, one emperor or one team around the emperor was really so intelligent, connected, powerful, that they could pull all these strings that a lot of these conspiracy theories have them pulling? You know, it's in many ways. Well, there's a lot I could say, but you know, it's very difficult. And if you really do believe that the emperor's right behind all this, you know, this biologist, you know, marine biologist, you know, when did he have all the time, and where did he have the training, and who helped him, and you know,
yes,
what was Kunaicho doing? There's,
yes.
I just have so many questions, you know.
I agree. I agree. But if I could respond first, number one, I think what you're doing is wonderful. And that is what I mean by that is that I find even with well-informed Japanese that they have so little understanding of that era. And it's so important for young Japanese in particular to begin to come to grips, to wrestle with what actually happened and who was actually responsible. And I don't know, do you find, may I ask you, do you find it difficult? Do you find the students interested, and do you find them willing, well, how knowledgeable do you find them about this period, and how willing do you find them to entertain even ideas about the emperor's responsibility? Could I ask you that question?
Okay. First of all, it's very difficult, but in like my seminar classes, there's students that are selected and they know what they're getting into. So yeah, you're picking from a pool and you're getting people who are interested in Japanese history. And I have students, you know, who are prepared to sort of look into that, but they have very little knowledge of the 1920s, the 1930s, and the first part of the 1940s, and very little knowledge. I mean, I think much of our historiography myopically uses 1945 as a kind of year zero of Japanese history. And anything before that's kind of interesting, but it's not really relevant or important.
Yes, that's right. And I believe that that's been purposely done. And what I mean by that is that I've talked to so many students over the years, and they say, look, we studied Japanese history in high school and even in the university, but in particular in high school, when we would get up to the Meiji period, and then the teacher would say, oh, well, we don't have any more time this semester. We'll come back to that, or we'll talk about it in the future. And it's never talked about. And I think that is the Japanese young people are really being denied an opportunity to see what, I mean, all of them have been affected in some way by what happened in World War II. Their grandparents or their great-grandparents or somebody died or something, and yet it's just a big tabula rasa, a big blank. And I can't think that that is an accident, that is actually the way they have been, it's been designed. Their education has been designed to keep them ignorant. Because if you cover that period, you can't help but come to begin to question what was Emperor Hirohito's role during that time. And that today, as we know in Japan, this kind of conversation that we're having today, I could not have publicly in Japan unless I was willing to risk my life. There are people out there who do not want this. Herbert Bix, when he came back to Japan after his book was published, got death threats because of his book. Now, you mentioned Bergamini, and I have, Herbert Bix is really very critical of Bergamini. I'm not. I think Bergamini began the process, and he did put so much time and effort. I think he went way over the top. And, you know, as a historian, I think we can all see his problems. But the fact
Brian,
that
can I comment on what you just said?
Yes.
With regard to Herbert Bix, I've been interviewing atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki for a couple decades. I mean, you can't do it anymore because most of them have passed.
Yeah.
But this got me into the whole history of Korean forced labor.
Yes.
And I gave up years ago, actually, doing anything directly with universities in Japan. I work totally through communities. The documents that I get, the books I get, it's all through Zainichi and community connections, a lot of peace groups in those areas. Even when we interviewed survivors in Pyeongtaek in South Korea, it was just totally through alternative networks to the universities. And, you know, these people in Nagasaki, that alternative peace museum, they're constantly harassed by right-wingers. And it's just that what I do is completely underground, so I can really relate to what you were talking about in terms of what Bix faced.
Yes.
Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in.
Right. And
it's a tough history. And, you know, the actual history of what Japan was like in World War II internally is just, it's a vacuum almost, you know, in terms of the English stuff.
And that is a real, I mean, the Japanese young people, that is, I mean, we should all be so concerned and I'm sorry, who spoke before? And it's so important that you are giving that to them in the classroom. And I really admire you for that. And please continue. It's not that you have to believe this theory or that theory, but just to get them thinking and questioning and knowledgeable about it. That's the important thing. Yes, Jan, you were going to say something?
Yeah, first of all, I have to apologize. I have to run because here in Belgium it's still 1 p.m. and I have basically a class to teach. So thanks a lot. But just you know, I understand. I have similar experience in Japan with young students, but not always. No? So there's also a lot of interest. And if we see, for instance, that Yoshida Yutaka, Hitotsubashi University.
Oh, he is a friend of mine. He is a friend.
And Herbert Bix, also, I mean, long-time supporter. And so forth. Yoshida Yutaka's book, Nihongo Heishi, as you might know, I think it sold 500,000 issues. So this is not, of course, young Japanese necessarily who bought the book, but I do think that there is, at least there's a lot of scholarship available. It's always, of course, the question of the Gemba in the schools. So how is this really taught?
That's right.
But I would be also cautious to so easily dismiss that there is quite a fair interest still and openness also in the Japanese, also more politicized use than maybe even a decade ago. I have to run, but I just want to suggest if anybody, there is this fascinating NHK documentary. I was really totally surprised. It's called, I put it in the chat. It's called Kakute Jiu wa Shiseri. So in this way, the liberty is dying. And it is basically, it's not about directly your protagonists, but it's about the Nippon Shimbun and Ogawa Heikichi and so forth, and the rise of basically what Maruyama called this right-wing nationalism. And it's very interesting because it takes also local examples from Nagano prefecture, who Taisho period Jiu Kyoiku teacher flipped into an ultranationalist and so forth. So I still, just to say from my perspective, first of all, I agree with what just said. Thank you for your scholarship and go on. It's really amazing.
But anyway, could you go the name once? Kakute, what was the end of it?
Kakute Jiu wa Shiseri.
So Jiu wa Shiseri. I got it.
It's probably still on YouTube. If not, I might know where to get the file.
All right. If I need to, I'll get in contact with you. All right. Thank you
a lot. Sorry, I have to leave.
Okay.
Bye to everybody.
Bye.
Can I come in?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Can I bring you...
Could you introduce yourself, please, Roger? Who are you?
Oh, sorry. Right. Well, I'm not an academic. I'm in London, and if anything, I'm a film historian. So, but But anyway, I do read around history quite a bit. But can I bring you back to your title and?
Yes.
And also your rhetorical questions about, well, if X was doing, was around while Y was happening, then these things.
That's right.
I mean, my way of reading it would be to say that it's another example of how religion trumps morality. That once, once a religious aspect is in, then the morality seems to go by. I mean, you can just look at the use of the word of crusade in the last 1,000 years in the West, and you can see that as well. And so, but as a question, I mean, how would you say that if it was a conspiracy of Zen Buddhism, as to how in the high Spiritism era, from say 41 to 45, would you read that Zen Buddhism was the dominant faction in Japan?
No, thank you for asking the question, Roger, but that's really totally what I'm not saying. Okay? What I'm saying, though, is that what's particularly, from my point of view as a Zen Buddhist, particularly disturbing is the fact that Zen Buddhism would always allow itself to be used to promote the interests of the powerful in Japan. Traditionally, that was the samurai class, but in contemporary Japan, it's been the military. And one thing I would disagree with you is your statement that you said religion trumps morality. I don't feel that is the way it really works. Rather, I would say that, remember the slides in which they talked about that they believed they were exercising great compassion in their assassinations. So what I believe the role of religion is to give a moral facade, or to convince the perpetrators, and I think this is as true of Islam and the Crusaders. They sincerely believe in their hearts that as they kill and rape and pillage, whatever, all of the things that they do, that they're conducting a moral act, and that it is a godly act, or it is a Buddhist act. It's in accord with the Buddha Dharma. That I think that's really one of the frightening things I think about this group of terrorists was they believe there is a Buddhist sutra called the Hobenkyo. Anyway, I don't want to go. It's a long story, but anyway, you come out of that sutra believing that it is sometimes moral, it is sometimes just, it is sometimes right to kill a few people in order that many may live. And so once you accept that, then it makes you feel righteous that you are doing the right thing, the just thing. And this gives you a power that you would not have had without the religious underpinnings. Does that make sense?
You don't persuade. In fact, if anything, what you're saying reinforces my own view, but there we are. We're not going to agree on that.
Well, the other thing too is that I have not suggested at all there was any Zen conspiracy. Not at all. The Zen is like putty. You can mold it in any way you want to. So it was not the Zen people who were involved in any kind of conspiracy. Rather, it was Zen training that allowed these young people to carry out these assassinations that they might otherwise not have done without the Zen training. So if there were a conspiracy, it's not a Zen conspiracy, but it was a conspiracy of the leaders, some leaders in Japanese society at that time who were willing to use Zen to further their efforts. Does that make sense?
Yes.